Welcome, welcome. This is you're in the right place if you are here for the Philadelphia College Prep Roundtable network meeting. Our network meetings are by and large virtual, particularly since the awful things that happened in 2020. I won't even say the name anymore. But I will say this, we in some ways, we'll keep a lot of a virtual space because while Philadelphia is in our name, we have attracted folks from around the country. So if you are not, Sonia, from the Philadelphia area, if you're outside the Philadelphia area, drop your city and state in the chat for us because that would be cool to see too. So Philadelphia College Prep Roundtable, we support the professionals who support the students. And that message has been resonating with people from around the country. So we welcome you for sure for that. And so we're here today to talk about supporting immigrant students in uncertain times. And so the whole idea is to give tools for you guys, the college access and success community professionals. And we're really excited because this is a fantastic organization. So we have Dr. Corinne Kentor, with us today. And she's a senior manager of research and policy at the President's Alliance. So she leads the Alliance's data and research initiative and oversees the organization's research partnerships. And so she's leading national expert in my favorite area, uh, college access, but specifically around financial aid access and mixed status family issues. And so I bring to you a new friend to the room. Welcome, Corinne.
Thank you so much, Candace. I was distracted when my own face suddenly got really big as I was spotlighted, but I really
Sorry.
appreciate the introduction. Thank you all so much for welcoming me to the space today. I'm really excited to be with you all to talk about some strategies and information for supporting immigration impacted students, particularly as you are thinking about their college options and their post-secondary pathways. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and you'll all have access to this slide deck after the presentation today, so no need to scribble furiously. Everything that is on the screen will be available to you. And I'll also be sharing some different links and resources with Candace and Tom after today's session so that you can have access to everything that I'm going to be mentioning. Okay, so I am going to go ahead and share right here and hopefully get it nice and big. Just a few logistical notes as I start to go through the presentation today. I often find it really challenging to see the chat when I also have my screen shared, but I have a few pauses built in to the presentation. So please feel free to drop questions, reactions, thoughts into the chat as I'm speaking, and I will pause at various moments to take a look and see if I can answer your questions. As I warned Candace and Tom before y'all entered the Zoom room today, I can talk a lot and I can talk really, really fast, especially when it's a topic I get excited about. So if things are moving too quickly, please just feel free to interrupt me, raise a hand, unmute, ask me to slow down, things like that. So as Candace mentioned in her wonderful introduction, my name is Corinne Kentor, and I'm the Senior Manager of Research and Policy at the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration. It's a very long name, but this is a little bit about what we do. So we bring together institutions of higher education around the immigration issues impacting students, faculty and staff, and campus communities more broadly. So our membership, the presidents in our title, are the presidents and chancellors of nearly 600 colleges and universities throughout the United States. But we don't just represent the leaders, we also represent the institutions and the students, faculty, and staff that they serve. We're currently in 42 states, DC, and Puerto Rico, so we have a pretty wide geographic spread. And when we say that we represent colleges and universities, we really represent every kind of institution that you can imagine. So our membership includes community colleges, land-grant institutions, large research university systems, small liberal arts colleges, faith-based institutions. It really runs the gamut. And the populations that we focus on also kind of spread across the different range of immigration impacted students, faculty, and staff, including undocumented students with and without DACA, international students and scholars, refugee and displaced students, and immigrant origin students as well. So second generation immigrants born or second generation students born to immigrant parents. It's in my title that I do research and policy, so I am going to talk a lot about the research that we do at the Alliance as a way to ground our conversation, and to make sure that we all have a collective understanding of who we're talking about when we're talking about policies impacting immigrant origin and international students. This is a little bit more about our approach. You can learn more in our website if you're interested, particularly those of you who are affiliated with higher education institutions who are in the room. If you want to know if you are one of our members, definitely feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to connect you to let you know about some of the other resources. Here's our agenda. As I said, I'm going to give some background on immigrant and international populations in higher education, ground us in the understanding of who these students are and what they're contributing to our campuses, and also talk a bit about the policy landscape facing students as they consider their post-secondary options. When I spoke to Candace and Tom about the group's interest for today, there was particular interest in two resources that we've put out recently. One is a toolkit on responding to immigration enforcement on campus, and one is more generally on supporting student well-being in uncertain immigration-related times and an uncertain policy context. So I'm going to focus on those two topics specifically, but know that we can always shift to have a broader discussion about some of the other things that I'll mention. And then I'll conclude with an overview of some of our toolkits and walk you through the Higher Ed Immigration Portal, which, if you're not familiar, is a one-stop shop with advocacy resources, research, toolkits, practitioner-facing resources, storytelling, all on the intersection of higher education and immigration. A little disclaimer, initially, as you may have seen in the ad, I was going to be joined by my colleague, Monica Andrade, who is our Vice President for Legal Strategy and State Policy. She is not available today, so I'm going to be covering some of her sections, but I would be remiss in impersonating Monica if I did not mention that this presentation is for informational purposes only and should not be construed as legal advice. Okay, that's all of my background information. Now I'm actually going to get into the good stuff, which is who are we talking about when we talk about immigrant origin and international students? When we're thinking about the future of U.S. higher education, we cannot disentangle that from the future of immigrant and immigrant origin students. If we look at the data between 2000 and 2023, which is the most recent year that we have, we can see that 84% of domestic enrollment growth has been driven by first and second generation immigrants. So first generation immigrants refer to students who themselves were born outside of the United States with no U.S. citizenship at birth. And second generation immigrants refers to students who were born in the US to one or more immigrant parents. So that's who we're talking about. And if we're thinking about, again, the growth and the future of US higher education, those students are really critically important. You can see the breakdown here and the shift between third generation and higher students who were born in the US to US born parents between 2000 and 2023, and how these populations have grown. A lot of this growth has been driven, oh, sorry for the typo, I'll fix that before you get the slides. A lot of that growth has been driven by second generation immigrants, this population here, who have experienced 165% growth since 2000. So these, again, are the students who were born in the United States to immigrant parents. And when we're thinking about the impact of immigration policies on higher education options, we need to be thinking not just about the students who are themselves immigrants, but also those who belong to immigrant and mixed status communities, because they are also impacted by some of the policies that affect their loved ones and their community members. So immigrant origin students are not just important when we're thinking about the general sustainability of higher education. They're also important when we're thinking about how higher education is evolving to become slowly more reflective of the diversity of US communities today. So what you can see here is the diversity breakdown of students in higher education, comparing US-born students from US-born families, those third-generation students, and immigrant origin students, first and second generation. And you can see that the immigrant origin students are far more reflective of the diversity of the United States population than third-generation and higher students who enroll in higher education. So these students are not just important kind of for the general sustainability of the higher education sector, but also for contributing diverse experiences and perspectives to the classroom, to the social experience on campus, to extracurricular opportunities, and to the future workforce, whether it's in higher ed or outside of it. But when we talk about immigrant origin students, we also have to think about how they are impacted differently on the basis of their immigration status. So this gives you a little bit of a breakdown of that first generation population. About a little more than half of the first generation immigrant population is naturalized, meaning that they have some form of permanent status, and just under 50% are non-citizens, but that can incorporate a diverse range of statuses. So it can be students with refugee status, temporary protected status, those who are fully undocumented, and those who are undocumented with deferred action for childhood arrivals or DACA. I really want to zero in on DACA status because I think it is one of the biggest misunderstandings about undocumented students in high school and in higher education. I should have said at the beginning, I'm based in DC, though I grew up in Southern California in the San Fernando Valley. Um, and one of my pet peeves as someone who spends a lot of time around other policy folks in the DC area is that I hear the word DACA used as a proxy for undocumented all the time. I hear people referring to DACA students, DACA kids, and thinking that they are referring to the undocumented student population. But as you can see here, very few undocumented students today are eligible for DACA. There are a couple of reasons for this, but the thing that accounts for it the most is that in order to qualify for DACA, students needed to arrive in the United States before 2007. And if we do some very simple math, we can see that students who are graduating from high school today are very unlikely to have arrived that early on in order to qualify for the program. And so what this means is that most of the students that are graduating from high school and most of those entering higher education today who are undocumented are fully without protections from deportation or access to work authorization. And that can really affect their eligibility for different programs and services, as well as the way that they're thinking about the role that higher education might play in their post-secondary life. It's also really important that we think critically about who DACA recipients are in higher ed. Most of the DACA recipients in higher education today are graduate students or are faculty and staff. The average DACA recipient is about 35 to 40 years old, so calling them DACA kids really isn't a relevant term at this point in time. They are more likely to be your DACA peers than they are to be your DACA students. And this is important also as you're thinking about different programs that your school might produce, different services that they might offer, and to make sure that those are inclusive of students regardless of their DACA status. So that's the kind of national landscape, but I did want to focus in on Pennsylvania. I know we have some folks in the room who are from other states. All of the information that I'm citing is available on the portal, and I'd be happy to connect you to some data points that are relevant to your state context as well, if you're interested. But to zero in on Pennsylvania, about 18% of students in higher ed in Pennsylvania are immigrant origin, and this includes about 73,000 second generation immigrants, those born in the US to immigrant parents, and 67,000 first generation immigrants. And we estimate that there are about 1,000 undocumented students graduating from high school in Pennsylvania annually. This doesn't even include the international student population, which makes an equally large contribution to higher education systems. So you can see here just some of the figures related to international students. Those are all separate from all of the data that I've been talking about so far with immigrant origin students. So why have I been talking about all of this data and throwing a bunch of numbers at you? Part of it is because it's really important to recognize that the policy developments that I'm going to be talking about are not just being experienced by a small portion of our student population. This is something that is impacting many students in your schools, in your programs, students who are thinking about higher education and their career pathways. And again, it doesn't just impact those students who are themselves immigrants, it also impacts that second generation population whose parents are immigrants, whose siblings may not have status, whose loved ones are impacted by the different policies that I'm going to be talking about. A lot of information. Hopefully that was some helpful grounding. And it's also some tools that I encourage you to use if you are engaged in advocating for your students in order to demonstrate the kind of widespread importance of supporting this student population. Something that I find in my work in DC is that it's really helpful to talk about these big numbers, but the most helpful thing that you can do is to ground that number in an individual story or experience. So when people understand that out of that large immigrant origin population, that is many, many students having unique experiences exemplified by one story, that's when the message really starts to hit home. Okay, this is where I get into some of the kind of deeper, heavier content where I'm going to talk a bit about the federal policy landscape impacting immigrant origin students. Some of this may be familiar to you and some of it may be new. I want to give a kind of a little bit of a preface by saying that things are changing really fast. I'm going to talk about some specific things that are changing and that have been changing over the last year or so. But probably one of the biggest differences that we've seen over the last 2 years, year and a half-ish, has been a tendency to just flood the zone, is a term you might hear. A lot's changing and things are happening through unusual channels. So there's been a lot of policy making happening through things like executive orders or things like a new interpretation of an established policy. And the result is that it creates a lot of confusion, not only for immigrant families, but also for the educators that are serving them. So if you take any message away from this presentation, it's that when there is news about a new policy development, take a pause, don't preemptively comply. Make sure that your school and your administration fully understands their responsibilities and doesn't over respond to a new announcement. A lot of the policy developments that I'm going to be talking about are undergoing legal challenges, and it means that for the time being, nothing necessarily needs to change in how you're serving students. And so, one of the best things that you can do is to stay informed and again, to make sure that whatever program or school you're affiliated with is not taking preemptive action to restrict opportunities for immigrant students. This first bullet point, scrutiny of humanitarian pathways, refers to students who are refugees or displaced. So, students who ordinarily would have come to the United States through different humanitarian programs, including receiving something like temporary protected status or parole, or who might have received refugee status before coming to the United States. These pathways are under a lot of scrutiny in different ways. So currently, refugee admissions are suspended, which means that no new refugees are coming into the United States. And the administration has introduced a plan to review existing refugee cases for those who have not adjusted to legal permanent resident status. In addition, the administration has decided to terminate or fail to renew temporary protected status for a variety of countries. Some of these, again, are facing legal challenges, and there are a lot of really powerful efforts underway to protect temporary protected status. But what this all means is that there's a lot of fluidity when it comes to the status that your humanitarian impacted students may hold. So essentially, it means that students may be falling in and out of status over the next couple of years. And there's some fluidity in terms of who is considered fully undocumented versus who has some form of protection. And that can have implications for their access to aid, to programs and services, and also just their sense of security about the future of their ability to remain in the United States in the future. This is mirrored in what's been happening with DACA. So we have a timeline that I can point you all to after the presentation that sort of walks you through what's been happening with the DACA case and the efforts to terminate the DACA program. Essentially, what's happening right now, if I were to give you all the too long didn't read version, it's that the considerations about the impact of what's going to happen with DACA are currently restricted to Texas. So everything that I'm talking about would only happen to DACA recipients in Texas and would not impact DACA recipients in other states. And what the Fifth Circuit recently decided is that they partially invalidated work permits for DACA recipients, but retained protection from deportation. So they basically split the two aspects of the DACA program and said that the work authorization component might be unlawful, but the protection from deportation is lawful. So DACA recipients in Texas are facing the possibility of losing access to their work authorization, but they would not lose access to their deportation protections. The next step is that it's not clear exactly how this would be implemented if this decision were to move forward. For example, if someone moves out of Texas for 2 years, do they regain their work authorization and then they move back? Do they lose it? We are also in a virtual work environment. So if someone is working for a business in Texas but living outside of Texas, do they have work authorization? And what about vice versa? Those are all some open questions. And at the same time, even though the court has retained the protection from deportation, we have been seeing increased reports of detentions and deportations of both DACA recipients and non-DACA recipient dreamers. And so we are aware of the fact that DACA is not necessarily the robust protection that it was once considered to be. This is coupled, if we think about the kind of higher ed implications, with overall efforts to restrict access to higher education for non-citizen students. There are two things in particular that I want to talk about. And I'm actually going to start with my second bullet point, which is threats to Plyler v. Doe. For those who are not familiar, and I apologize for the many terms that are getting thrown at you right now, Plyler v. Doe is the Supreme Court case that established that all students are entitled to a K through 12 education, regardless of their immigration status. And specifically, that K-12 schools cannot charge tuition, public K-12 schools cannot charge tuition to students based on their immigration status. This case is definitely under threat at the moment. The Heritage Foundation published a playbook a couple of months ago outlining what they see as the plan for states to challenge Plyler v. Doe locally, with the idea of hopefully getting one of those cases up to the Supreme Court to overturn the protections in the next couple of years. For the time being, nothing has changed when it comes to access to K-12 education, but these threats demonstrate a kind of pipeline of exclusion that begins in the K-12 schools and moves all the way up through the workforce of trying to restrict opportunities for students on the basis of immigration status. What this looks like in higher education really comes through when we're thinking about tuition equity and scholarship programs, and then any kind of specialized program that provides benefits to undocumented students. I think as of 2024, if I'm getting my dates right, 25 states and DC offered some form of a tuition equity policy, which means that students, regardless of immigration status, who are eligible could access in-state tuition rates at their public colleges and universities. And in some cases, I think about 18 states and DC, students could also access in-state financial aid. We have seen a couple of different ways that these policies have been rolled back in 7 or 9 states at this point. Some of these rollbacks have been happening through lawsuits where the federal government has sued a state on the basis of their tuition equity policy. And in some cases where a state has introduced litigation to try to change their policy and rescind access for students. These cases have all been developing differently. And one important message here that kind of aligns with the preemptive compliance message is that states really need to understand that their tuition equity policies are lawful and are robust. And what's happening in one state doesn't necessarily mean that you should rescind access in another state. I will link after this call a playbook that we put together on defending tuition equity policies that walks you through everything from why these policies are important, how states can develop a robust defense of their policy, and then also what states can do if they face a challenge and if access to in-state tuition and financial aid is rescinded, as has happened in a couple of states, and how you can support students who are facing interruptions to their education. All of this is coupled with this kind of broader congressional inaction. This is one of the first years in recent memory that there hasn't been some version of a DREAM Act introduced in Congress, and there hasn't been a lot of attention paid to permanent protections. And as you've all likely seen in the news, there have been ongoing debates over DHS funding for the Department of Homeland Security and whether there can be any restrictions imposed on DHS operations. I know this is all a lot. That really focused on the kind of domestic non-citizen student population. I do want to take a brief moment to talk about international students who are also facing a lot of challenges. This chart here really kind of walks you through the different ways that international students are facing disruptions to their education, all the way from recruitment of international students to study in the United States through to their opportunities while they're in college and then their postgraduate pathways. I'm not going to dwell too much on it here, although I'm happy to answer questions if anyone has specific questions on the policies that are impacting international students. But I bring it up because I think over the last year, we've seen that these populations are not necessarily as distinct as one might think. Oftentimes, people really separate international student issues from undocumented and refugee and displaced student issues. But as we've seen with immigration enforcement efforts on campus, for example, these populations are intertwined, and policies that impact one do kind of spill over and impact another. And so it is important to be paying attention to what's happening across populations while keeping kind of priority attention on the population that you serve. So as promised, I'm going to take a pause and check the chat and see if I can answer any specific questions. I'm seeing mostly just some comments here. Thank you so much for the love for the portal. I really appreciate it. We definitely spend a lot of time on it, so glad it's useful. Any questions at this stage that I can answer? Awesome. Please feel free to continue putting things in the chat as they come up, and I will take some other opportunities to pause and see what I can answer for you all. Okay, I know I said that that was the heavy portion. This is probably the really heavy portion. So as I said, when we were preparing for this session, I know one of the key questions was about immigration enforcement and the toolkit that we put out on responding to immigration enforcement on campus. Um, because I am a researcher, I like to take a step back and understand the landscape of how and why something is happening. So when we say that there has been increased immigration enforcement in school environments, why is that happening? How is that happening? What has been going on at the policy level in both overt and covert ways to facilitate this increased scrutiny of educational spaces? When we try to understand what we are seeing on campuses now, the first thing that we need to think about is the rescission of what's called the sensitive locations memo or sensitive locations protections. So it's kind of been a long-standing practice for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, that they limit immigration operations in areas that are really key for day-to-day well-being and for people to access the programs and services and resources that they need in order to live well. So this was formalized under the Biden administration through what's called the Sensitive Locations Memo, which spelled out where immigration activities should be minimized. They weren't totally like disallowed, they weren't banned by any means, but it was sort of a practice memo saying these are not priority areas. And the priority areas included healthcare service centers, so hospitals, clinics, places where you could receive vaccines, anything like that, educational environments, places of worship, things like that, with the idea being that these are not priority immigration enforcement areas. Under the current administration, that memo has been rescinded, and we have seen an uptick in prioritizing sensitive locations that otherwise would have been deprioritized for immigration enforcement. So this helps partially explain the kind of practical guidance that ICE officers are getting about where to prioritize their activities that has shifted away from, we're not going to focus on schools, churches and synagogues, hospitals, towards those are okay areas to focus activity on. Then this was coupled with another practice memo in May of 2025 that reinterpreted a long-standing kind of legal standard for ICE enforcement. And I'll walk you through the difference between an administrative warrant and a judicial warrant in a moment. But for a long time, the practice has been, and the law actually says, that federal immigration agents need a judicial warrant in order to enter a private residence. And this memo in May of 2025 basically said to ICE officers, that's wrong. You can use just an administrative warrant if someone has a final order of removal. As with many things, there has been legal action taken to counter this interpretation and this practice memo, but it's also something that has shifted how ICE enforcement officers are operating. Next, we have what are called 287G agreements. 287G agreements basically establish partnerships between federal immigration enforcement offices and local enforcement offices. So this can be something like a local police force. When they enter into a 287G agreement, they basically allow local enforcement to perform immigration-related functions. So, for example, if someone is stopped for a traffic violation, say they're getting a speeding ticket, that officer now has the authority to check for immigration status. If they suspect that someone is in the country without authorization, they can detain them on that basis, even though ordinarily that person would not be detained for something like a minor speeding ticket. And 287G agreements can extend into things like campus police. So campus police can also enter into 287G agreements. These are public, so you can figure out if there's a 287G agreement in your state or in your locality. But one of the reasons that this is really worrisome is because when we couple it with these other two pieces of changing how immigration officers operate and where they operate, and then we're also empowering other law enforcement officials to perform immigration functions, you're expanding the dragnet that could potentially impact immigrant families. And then this last piece is a recent court case that allows immigration officers to consider non-immigration related factors like language, accent, workplace, and quoting directly from the decision here, apparent race or ethnicity in performing immigration stops. So at this point, we've sort of changed where immigration officers can operate how they can operate, who can operate as an immigration officer, and then finally who they consider to be under suspicion of maybe not having authorized status. And so all of this together gives some context as to why we are seeing this massive expansion of immigration enforcement and how that's taking place. So when the administration named immigration enforcement and deportation as a priority, this is how that's being accomplished in practical terms. I know that is very heavy. So where I want to transition is not just from talking to you all about what is bad that's happening, but what does this mean for your day-to-day work? And then also, what does this mean for campus preparedness for the institutions of higher education that your students are going to enter if you're on the K-12 side and you're sending your students off to college in the next couple of years? These are some of the frequently asked questions that we get about why immigration officials might come to campus and how institutions can prepare, what areas of campus they can access, if there are any policies that institutions need to be aware of to make sure that they're in legal compliance, and then what are individuals' rights and what is the institution's role. All of this is answered in pretty good detail in the toolkit that I'll link you all to after this. And we also have some sample scripts and ways for people to respond and things like that. But one thing that I want to name here is that what we have been confronted with over the last few months is that preparedness is very important, but it is not always sufficient. And we can really encourage institutions to have a good plan in place and to be in compliance with the law and with best practices. But we understand that sometimes immigration enforcement is not in compliance with the law. And so what is really important in those cases is to establish very good documentation and make sure that your institution also has a plan in place for how to respond should a campus community member be detained by immigration officials on campus and what happens after that as well. Here are a couple of key distinctions to know. I will also say none of you are supposed to be immigration lawyers. These are some best practices so that you can hopefully feel a little bit more empowered in knowing about how these things work. But one of the best things that your institution can do is to have a clear chain of command in place so that you know the person that you can elevate things to. So you are not expected to be able to rattle off the law in your encounters. But what I would encourage you all to do if you don't already know it is to ask your leadership about their campus preparedness plan and to make sure that you know who you are supposed to contact if you are in an encounter with immigration enforcement. So this first distinction is what I alluded to earlier about the difference between a judicial warrant and an administrative warrant. A judicial warrant is signed by a federal judge, whereas an administrative warrant is issued by the Department of Homeland Security or by ICE and not by a judge. The judicial warrant is sufficient to authorize entry into a private or non-public space. An administrative warrant is not. They look different, but again, you should not be the one to determine if someone has a judicial or an administrative warrant. But someone at your school or your institution should have that knowledge and have that authority to be able to review a warrant before allowing entry into any non-public space. Again, that's one of the things that's under contention with this recent practice memo for Immigration and Customs Enforcement, stating that an administrative warrant is sufficient. It is not sufficient and the litigation is ongoing, so they do still need to present a judicial warrant. This is really coupled with the distinction between public space and private space. So all campuses have some public space that are publicly accessible, things like sidewalks, open lobbies, public buildings where events are hosted, and they have private space with restricted access. So things like a classroom during instruction is considered a private space, residence halls, and offices with restricted access. I've seen some really good examples of institutions that have maps published on their websites that clearly delineate public versus private space. And it's just really helpful for knowing kind of what's under the control of the institution and what is not. To be honest, like I get a lot of questions about responding to immigration enforcement on campus. I'm not as concerned about what happens on a college campus or on a high school campus. I am much more concerned about what happens on the bus route on the way to that campus. That is an area that an institution does not have as much oversight over, and is one of the places that I think a lot of our preparedness doesn't quite account for. It's not to say that this preparedness isn't important, but it's just to recognize that there are sort of limits to what we are able to do. So here's some practical guidance when it comes to emergency preparedness when we're thinking about immigration enforcement. First is to develop and regularly update the campus immigration response protocol. And as I was saying earlier, to identify a trusted point of contact. And it's also helpful if there is kind of a plan for contacting legal counsel and trusted external partners in the event that a student or other campus community member is detained. Any follow-up that happens on a student's immigration case should be in direct consultation with their independent counsel and with their family if their family is involved. And you should really be following their lead. But it's helpful to have reference points for what you can do in the event that a student is detained. Point number 3 is probably the most important, which is to establish clear internal communications channels and to establish clear external communications channels. This point down here about template communications for students, faculty, and staff. It's really important that we not spread misinformation. There are a lot of instances in which ICE agents come to a campus for a pre-designated purpose. There's a lot of compliance that happens anytime there are international students or international employees on a campus, and there are regular visits that take place, and those are not necessarily enforcement-related visits. It's also not always clear to folks who see a uniform and assume that it is an immigration enforcement officer, but may not know the distinctions. And it's really important that there be clear and trusted communication so that when you put out announcements, people can rely on them, trust them, and know that they are getting accurate information. Okay, so what is a scenario that someone might encounter? Let's say that a student reports seeing a federal immigration officer outside a campus building, and they're concerned and they start asking questions. This first action, as it says here, is to stay calm and to provide reassurance and factual information without speculation, because there are a lot of different things that could be happening. At the same time, you don't want to minimize students' concerns, but you should make sure that the institution is aware of this report and encourage students to make the decisions that feel safest for them, but you are not in a position to offer legal advice. It is really up to the student to determine what action they want to take. But what you should be doing is to contact your campus legal counsel, campus safety. And I have president's office here because I was thinking about higher ed institutions when we put together this toolkit, but whatever the equivalent of that might be for your organization. This is a clear sort of what you can and can't do. Again, just reaffirming sharing factual information, referring to official resources and communications, and making sure that you are in touch with your campus leadership without providing legal advice or making any kinds of suggestions about ways to evade enforcement and not spreading rumors or unverified information. I'm going to pause here and see if there are any questions or reflections. I don't think I saw anything come through in the chat.
No, Corinne, I don't see anything in the chat either so
Cool.
far.
Mhm.
Do you want to take a pause?
Sigurd's hand is raised and my hand is raised.
Oh, sure. Let me stop sharing for a moment so I can see faces. Sigurd, do you want to go ahead?
Yes, please. Thank you.
Mhm.
I think one of the reasons you're not getting that many questions, your presentation is amazing, just quite amazing. We're not seeing those dramatic scenes from up in Minnesota anymore.
Mhm.
Doesn't mean that ICE isn't working now.
Mhm.
Can you give us a sense of what's changed? Has there been any diminution of their work? What do we know?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say that the focus has shifted away from Minnesota specifically, and we do know that there are some other target states. I would say that and this is a bit of speculation from my end, but I would posit that one of the reasons that we are not seeing dramatic scenes is because there's a shift away from immigration raids, which is where there's kind of a flood of immigration enforcement officers all in uniform coming to the same location into some of these more administrative channels. So, for example, re-reviewing, calling in refugees for a re-review of their case, for example, or detaining individuals who come in for a regularly scheduled immigration appointment if they have a pending asylum case. So there's been more focus recently on this shift into administrative channels over these kind of bigger spectacles. I do also think that there is an element of public optics with the ongoing negotiations over DHS funding, and this question of whether there will be any policy restrictions introduced as part of that funding package. And so I think there is a bit more kind of careful operations right now. because there is this kind of open question of what's going to happen with the DHS funding package. I'm not
And
they're still operating. Like they have plenty of money. They're actually still operating with the shutdown, but it's less a question of will they get more money and more a question of will there be any restrictions, like official policy restrictions introduced as part of that funding package.
right. Thank you. A second question.
Mhm.
Before any of this stuff happens, helping our students understand this,
Mhm.
I just find it really challenging
Yeah.
to explain why this is happening, while at the same time, the people who staged a government insurrection several years ago are now pardoned and free and committing their own set of crimes to
Mhm.
do. What suggestions do you have about how we can help our students understand all of this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's not one that I think I will have the full answer to today. And I would love to hear from other folks in the room as well, how you're approaching these conversations. Something that I think about a lot is there is a lot of our immigration policy has been we've communicated about immigration policy as if immigration itself is a crime that someone has committed and that there needs to be a consequence for. And so all of this enforcement action is very um, oriented around that perspective. But really, and literally, immigrating to the United States is not a crime. And being in the United States without authorization is not a criminal offense. And that distinction is really important. And I think it is critical that when we are talking to students, we continue to remind them that their presence in the country or their family members' presence in the country is not a crime, in spite of what we are seeing and in spite of the rhetoric and the action that we are seeing. At the same time, um, immigrant communities are already living with this uncertainty and this fear. It is not necessarily new, but it is at a height that we have not seen before. And so I think it is important to talk to students practically about what this means for their sense of safety and their lives and the choices that they're making. There are elements of this, if we kind of bring it back to the college planning process, that have always been important, but that are even more critical, which is to talk to students about their comfort with going far away from home if they have an immigration impacted relative, or thinking about the way that your students may be taking on additional caregiving responsibilities. If, for example, their family member is no longer comfortable doing the grocery shopping or things like that. There are some real practical reorganizations that are happening within families that I think are important to incorporate into some of your conversations with students about their choices. Um, you all are in a really hard position because these are not easy questions to answer, or easy conversations to have. And you're not going to have an answer to it. But I think what you can do is create a space where students can talk through their concerns and how that's going to impact their academic choices, which is the place where you all can be really helpful in thinking through their options. Um,
Yeah, okay.
yeah.
Great. Good stuff. Good stuff. Good stuff. Um, so I'm kind of like tailing, actually my question, well,
Mhm.
it kind of tails off of Siggis's second question, and it didn't spur it. This is where I was going to ask. From a practitioner standpoint, particularly those of us who are not in a school building, there are those of us in who are employees of said school districts in this room today. But there are those of us who work alongside them as partners or stakeholders in helping our students. I think about coupling like with financial aid, there's somewhere where we
Mhm.
can go like from a government level, not government, I don't know. We go somewhere nationally, let me say it that way,
Yeah.
and we can see how things are flowing financial aid wise. Colleges are not necessarily, well, if they're getting federal funding, they have to report certain information that's public. That's just really where I'm going. Is there a place as a practitioner that when I build in my college fit plan with my student, is there somewhere I can go, and it probably is in your toolkit where I can see, for example, said college or university has had this many raids or they have this kind of plan in place. I mean, how
Yeah.
do I find that information so I can advise my student in terms of what they're getting ready to step into?
Yeah, we were talking about this a couple of weeks ago, within our team and whether we wanted to do some kind of heat map about immigration enforcement. There are a couple of reasons we decided not to do it, and one is that there are so many unverified reports, and making sure that that information is accurate is very difficult, and we don't want to spread misinformation about immigration enforcement activities. There are some things that you can do. So I'll drop our portal to the states in a moment. That can show you what state level policies are in place that are potentially relevant to immigrant populations. So you can see at least at the state level kind of what's going on and how that might be impacting different opportunities available to students. Um, I would say a lot of schools, while they may not have their full preparedness plan on their website, they might have like an immigration task force or something like that, or a web page where they have information and resources for their immigrant populations. And that's something that I would encourage you to look for in consultation with a student. And it's not, it's a little bit more labor intensive because it's not one place that you can go to find it, but it's something that you can find about a school to help you understand a little bit about their preparation. Something else that I will say is that I want to give a lot of credit to institutional leaders, and it's something that my position has given me a lot more empathy for than I had before I worked with the President's Alliance, which is understanding that so much is happening that is not necessarily public. And so there often are very comprehensive plans in place, even if they are not readily apparent to students. And sometimes communications might feel frustrating, but there might be a rationale behind it. That being said, I also think it is important for people to be on the same page and to have the information. So you also want to make sure that you are sending students into an environment where they will feel safe and informed. Um, so I'll drop the state policy. I'll add it to my list of resources to send you, but it's basically a map where you can look at what's happening at the state level. And then there are things that you can look for in terms of like whether a school has an immigration task force. Um, I'm going to go back to presentation really quickly just because I want to take you through a few more things um, in the time that we have left. So in addition to the toolkit that I've mentioned on immigration enforcement, we have some resources on supporting students' the mental health impact of all of the things that I've just named, including addressing chronic fear from fear of deportation and family separation, the anxiety that students are contending with, signs of depression in students, and stress, and all of the ways that this can impact their well-being in addition to their ability to engage academically. So some of the recommendations that we have in here kind of rely on this avoiding preemptive compliance, making sure that you are still keeping resources available to students, even though there are a lot of challenges that institutions are facing. And you want to make sure that you can continue offering services in a way that is safe and accessible to students. We have a new working group that's focused on centers who have decided to change their name because they are concerned about the scrutiny that might be placed on centers that are specifically devoted to undocumented student services. And some of these requests have come from students themselves who want to make sure that the space still feels safe for them. But it's a process that needs to be navigated very carefully to make sure that students don't feel like they're facing all of these challenges and all of this danger and fear, and that their institution is pulling away from them. So it is important to maintain this public affirmation of students' experiences and providing them with services in a way that also respects their desires for safety. So again, I just wanted to name that I know I'm not going to get into it in detail here, but I'm happy to point you all to this, and then also to some of our other resources, some of the playbooks that I mentioned before. And then I also really wanted to highlight some of our resource hubs. So we specifically have a hub dedicated to financial aid access for mixed status families. We're working on a comprehensive guide that will walk you through everything you need to know if you are supporting a student filling out the FAFSA and applying to college as a member of a mixed status family. I know there's a lot of questions about FAFSA stuff, which I am happy to engage with. This is my special area of interest that I could truly do hours and hours of presentations just on the FAFSA, so happy to spend some time there. And then we also have this broader rights and protections hub that has some guidance for institutions and non-citizen students. So some of the different Know Your Rights information that might be helpful is here as well. And then the last thing that I'll say, especially thinking about the question that Sigis raised, is to encourage you all to look at the Undocumented Community of Practice and Action, which is a space for practitioners who are working with undocumented student populations to share some of these questions and insights, connect to resources, gather some examples from other schools and institutions, And then also really to talk about these questions like the one that Sigis raised about how do you engage in a productive conversation with your students when it is very difficult to understand the environment that we are operating under. So just wanted to give a quick shout out to some of these resources and other opportunities to continue the conversation beyond the hour that I have with all of you today. And then to ground us again in why it matters, I think we all know why it matters intuitively. But if you had to name it to someone else, this is if we think back to the beginning of my presentation, and that 84% of domestic enrollment growth driven by immigrant origin students. This information is important because we care about students and because they deserve access to educational spaces and living spaces and a country that welcomes and affirms their contributions. And also, the country does need them. And you can hold both things at the same time. What is happening right now is disrupting a really critical talent pipeline that is going to impact not just institutions of higher education, but also our local economies and our ability to continue investing in regional and national growth. And this is really about a generation of talented individuals who have who are going to our schools now who want to continue their education and put their degrees to work. And this is an opportunity for us all to continue investing in their pathways and also demonstrating why they are so important to our schools, our communities, our nation at large. And that is what we were trying to do at the President's Alliance, but we do it through these kinds of conversations with all of you. And I just want to say how grateful I am for the work that you're doing with students. It's probably the piece about my job that I miss the most is that I get to talk to practitioners a lot, which is really fantastic. But I always sneak in my FAFSA conversations week to week because getting to talk to students about their hopes and dreams is is just such a privilege that I really love about the work that we do. A question I got on another panel recently was about what's keeping you hopeful. And hopefully this will resonate with all of you. But I think if you work in education and especially in college access and in higher education, that is an extremely hopeful industry. Going to college is about this belief that there is more to learn, there are more people to meet, that the world can get bigger and that your experience can get deeper. And so you can't help but be hopeful when you work in that kind of space alongside students who are investing in that future. So I'm going to stop there and not get too mushy-gushy beyond what I've already done. I will put together a big list of everything to share with all of you. I don't want to take up much more of your conversation space. So just thank you all again for the time that you've invested. Totally agree. College is not just about getting a job, although a job is also good and nice, and we all get paid and can pay our bills. So I think it is a both and situation for students. But I just really appreciate the work that you all are doing to have these difficult conversations with students and with your schools and community members. I will also drop my email in the chat. You're welcome to reach out if you want to follow up on anything that we discussed today. And I'll leave some open space if anyone wants to raise anything.
Well, I don't know about you all, but that was probably one of the best presentations on that issue that I've seen in a long time. And, maybe even to say ever. It was just so comprehensive. Like a lot of times you get presentations on this issue and they kind of hone in on a specific area and you covered all of them. So wow, well done. I'm so excited that we invited you, Corinne, for real. Or should I say Dr. Corinne, to be respectful.
I'll take Corinne. I only make my family call me Dr.
Well,
Corinne.
but that's a lot of work and we want to acknowledge that you achieved that level. But I have to say, and I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that I know I will be recommending that we bring you back. So we have okay, I'm getting a lot of head nods and snaps and okay, thank you, Sonia. Yeah. So because PCPR does a number of different types of meetings, our network meeting is one. We have symposia, forums, and other spaces where we discuss and provide professional development. And so because this is not an issue that has end date where there's nothing updated and, there will always be new things going on. I really do anticipate that we would be bringing you back. So stay tuned, watch your emails. So if you can join me, many of you have already snapped and clapped and all the things. If you can join me in thanking. Now I feel like there may be a couple questions in the chat that I see some things. I think we're a small group. If you're not shy and you'd like to ask audibly, you can come off of mute at this point, and ask a question or make a comment. Oh, I see. Would love to talk with you about FAFSA. Well, you know what? In a couple of minutes that we do have, Corinne, do you mind a few words on FAFSA? Is there anything on your mind in particular that you could share with regard to FAFSA in this moment?
Yeah, so I focused a lot on non-citizen students in this presentation, but I also do a lot of work on mixed status families, as I mentioned at the beginning, and particularly on FAFSA access for students with non-citizen contributors. So, currently we're sort of back where we started pre-Better FAFSA in terms of their experience with filling out the form. It's still, a manual form for mixed status families. I keep a very close eye on data security concerns when it comes to FAFSA information. At this point in time, amidst the many data sharing agreements happening among federal agencies, there is no agreement that allows DHS to use FAFSA information for immigration enforcement. This is a very big topic again that we could spend another hour talking about. But if there are any questions about kind of the state of FAFSA data security, or if anyone has experiences from filling out the FAFSA with a mixed status family this year that you would like to share. I would also just point you all to maybe a topic that it might seem a little niche, but I'm seeing it more and more. I've been getting a bunch of questions on how to deal with disruptions to family finances and housing as a result of immigration enforcement. So we worked with this fantastic organization called Schoolhouse Connection that's focused on unaccompanied homeless youth. I see a lot of nods. And so we worked with them on some of the complexities of homelessness as a result of immigration enforcement and what that means for students' financial aid opportunities. The TLDR of that is that it is case by case, it is complicated, but something to be mindful of as you're working with families is your relationships with financial aid offices at local institutions that you work with, and talking to them about PJs for financial aid packages, dependency overrides, looking for different ways to adjust students' packages in response to disruptions in their housing as a result of immigration enforcement. So those are some things that are top of mind for me, but would love to hear from all of you if there's anything else that I can speak to.
Hear, hear, amen. That everything is built on a relationship. And in this space and in this point in time, that is absolutely the direction to go. I appreciate that. Okay, couple minutes. Does anybody have anything that they want to share? Anything, any last minute burning questions? Okay, folks, you might be thinking about something later, so please use Dr. Corinne's contact information if you have questions for her, and then also let us know if there's something that PCPR can do to address an issue or get some information out there for you. But once again, if you all could join me in just thanking Dr. Corinne Kenter, that was an outstanding presentation and we really appreciate it. Thank you so much.